Tonight, Dr. Plague reads, The Lights Stay On. Enjoy. Good evening, all my children of the night. It is I, Count Mo. Tonight, I bring you the finest tales from Reddit's No Sleep subreddit. So sit back, relax, and let this dark veil fall about you as we delve into another spooky tale. I looked at the computer screen, making sure that everything was in place for tonight's reading, as a few more regulars popped into chat. I had 35 so far, same 35 that showed up with some regularity, but I could draw as many as 100 at a time before the story was over. That may not seem like many, but considering that I wasn't sitting half naked in front of a camera or giving away lavish prizes, I consider my readings to be pretty well attended. I'd only been reading stories on YouTube for about a year when one of them took off like a shot, and I finally crossed the threshold into 1,000 subscribers. That was about the time I started adding a live reading of a random story every week. Just something to help promote a random Reddit writer, so they might benefit from having their story heard by a limited audience like mine. I was sitting in my favorite chair, my cape drawn around my velvety top, my hair gleaming from the product used to keep it down, my fake vampire teeth making my voice sound thick and slurry. This was my costume, Count Mo, and it was probably about as original as the ideas from the stories I read. If they could see the pajama pants I was wearing just out of camera, I'm sure that the illusion that I was a real vampire reading internet stories in his lair would be ruined. Something made a sound in the room behind me, something like a rustling in the closet, but I just figured it was Chester, my big orange tomcat. It made me look away for a moment, casting my eyes into the darkness beyond the green screen, which I'd covered with an old tapestry from Party City. The blackout curtains kept even the streetlights from ruining my ambience, and the hour at which I always did these streams made for a room as dark as pitch. The glow of my computer monitor was the only light present, and it lit my face wetly as I turned back to the screen. I could see my image in that little window box, the playback tab, as it recorded, and I suddenly turned back and spat my teeth onto the desk with a flourish. This was another part of the intro, the losing of my teeth, since they made it almost impossible to read understandably. "Now," I said, smiling, "let's start tonight's show. Tonight we'll be reading Voices in the Woods by Faust's Enema." Jesus, where do you guys come up with these usernames? Well then, my children of the night, let's begin. I looked over the other tab, finding the story and starting at the beginning. Before starting tonight's stream, I had read enough of it a few times, familiarizing myself with the tale. It was a pretty predictable little story. Scouts in the woods, harassed by a monster. I was pretty confident that I could read it without stumbling too hard over the words. There was nothing worse than watching someone read over a stream and having to suffer through them constantly muddying the words. I heard something creak its way through the closet door, but put it off as just Chester again. It was just going to be a typical camping trip out in the woods. Davy, Kevin, and I were so excited. We always look forward to these camping trips, and the yearly spring campout was one of the best. All the scouts would set up at Grayson's Falls, and there we would meet up with the 5 other local troops for a jamboree. There would be canoeing and races and s'mores, of course, the annual scary story contest. I heard the noise again, this time a little louder than before. It sounded like something pushing the closet door open. For some reason, the vent in my apartment is in the closet, so I always leave it cracked for suitable ventilation. I tried not to hiss under my breath at Chester as he came out of my closet, probably sleeping on a pile of my dirty clothes again, since now my stream would be inundated with the sounds of my AC running. Set up our tent a little further back from the others, Scoutmaster Larry giving us a set area where we could pitch our tents. No sooner had I picked a spot than Davy hissed at me to follow them into the woods. But Scoutmaster Larry said, I heard the springs creak on my bed as that big old Tom jumped up and decided that it might be time for a diet. He sounded like he may have gained some weight over the last couple of feedings. "Who cares what Scoutmaster Larry said? Do you want to camp or what?" So we set up my tent there as a decoy and moved off into the woods as I followed Davy to the place where Kevin was setting up our actual campsite. "But what if they look for us?" I asked. Davy just waved his hand at me. "We'll go back to eat, and then after dinner, we'll head back to our campsite. We'll wake up before anyone gets good and stirring tomorrow, and we'll be back in camp before they notice anything." I was trying to maintain eye contact with the camera as I read, but something was making the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. It felt like someone was watching me with an intense level of scrutiny, and it was really throwing me off. I reached down to have a sip of my water and decided to power through the stream. It was just Chester after all. He was just being a dumb cat. So the scouts went to their secret camp out in the woods, and the storyteller admitted that it was pretty cool. They set up their own fire pit, got their own water, and were prepared for the night when they left to rejoin the scout troop. The rest of the day proceeded normally. A meal was served, some announcements were made, and then everyone left to go tuck in for the night. As I read this out, I could see myself getting more and more anxious in the after image of my computer. I was stumbling over about 3 words a paragraph, and I considered going over to the bed to put Chester out. I don't want to mess up the stream though, so just took another sip of water and tried to power through it. When I reached for my cup, apologizing to my audience for the small break, my foot moved and touched something soft and warm under my desk. I thought it must have been a slipper, but then it rolled over and wrapped its little paws around my foot. I looked down, nearly spilling my water, and I caught sight of Chester as he wrapped his sleepy little paws around my foot. I felt a chill slide up my neck. If Chester were here, then who was on my bed? I glanced at the reverse image on the webcam, trying to probe the darkness, and wished to Christ I hadn't. Something was staring at me from the midnight gulf, a distance of 10 feet that might as well have been an endless sea. Its eyes looked huge, 2 round eggs that were laser focused on the back of my head. The room was too dark for me to see much, but it was enough to make me very nervous. I realized I'd been quiet for nearly 3 minutes, and I looked at those eyes a little longer and pondered my safety as the chat started to wonder what was happening. Sorry, folks, I was wool gathering for a minute. Let's get back to the story, shall we? As I read, I began to make my plan. I couldn't just bolt for the door. It would probably get me, whatever it was. I could push the green screen over on top of it and run, but that would be a great way to get myself shredded. I had no clue what it was, so fighting it was probably right out. So I thought, what the hell was I gonna do? As I read, I noticed that it just sat there, staring, not moving. It seemed to be listening to me. Maybe if I kept reading like I didn't notice it, the thing would go away. All kinds of nasty things were just waiting for you to notice them so they could kill you. If I could maintain my pace and just power through the story, maybe it would go away on its own. So I started reading, telling my audience how the children had descended into the woods looking for their campsite. As we went, we began to hear something in the trees. The others could hear it too. That much I was pretty certain of, but they were pretending they couldn't. We could all hear the sounds of animals as they moved about us. Bear and deer and raccoon and bird. Many of the birds didn't even appear at night, but their voices were raised in a chorus as they vied for our attention. When we reached the tent, we all went straight in, not daring to even sit by the fire we had built up for the night. I heard the springs creak as it moved atop the bed. Was it getting closer? Was it leaving? I looked at the monitor, struggling to keep reading, as I saw those eyes coming towards the edge of the bed, the edge closest to the computer. I gulped. It was creeping up on me. Suddenly, we were awakened from sleep by the sound of a familiar voice. I heard it as it jumped onto the floor just beside the bed. They were familiar voices, campers and scout masters we knew, and we could hear them in the woods. They were looking for us, searching for us, trying to find us as their voices clattered about the dark wilderness. Davy opened the tent, looking out into the darkness, but Kevin seemed scared as the voices grew closer and closer. Maybe we should go to them, guys. They're going to be mad if they find our tent out here. We can't just say we were out here using the bathroom. The carpet made an almost angry sound as the creature's feet dug into it. I heard my stutter becoming more pronounced as the fear washed over me. It was coming closer. I could smell it. It smelled like blood. Davy turned. Are you crazy? If we stay right where we are, they'll never find us. But Kevin didn't seem so sure. As we stood at the tent flap, Kevin finally bolted, running into the woods, yelling how he was sorry for making them look for us. His yells were cut off suddenly, very suddenly, and Davy and I just stood there as we looked out into the woods. It was taller than I would have thought it would be. I was picturing something the size of Chester, but this thing was almost as tall as I was sitting. I could still only see those eyes as it moved towards me, but as it came closer to the monitor, I could see more. Its face was skeletal, its eyes looking like a Halloween prop shoved into a bleached dog skull. Its jaws clacked a little as it walked, and though it was too far to my left to be seen by the reverse camera, I could see it just fine in my peripherals. I could see it too well, in fact. Davy and I stood looking out in the woods. The voices were still there, still calling, but now Kevin's voice had joined them. I was yelling, almost screaming, as the thing's wet breath puffed against my ear. I didn't dare stop. I didn't dare look at the live chat to see if anyone was saying anything weird about my little performance. I just read the story, wondering if the story had become a ticking clock on my own life. I had hoped it would leave, but what if it didn't? Davy, I said, the other boy turning to look at me, if they're out there looking for us, why don't they have flashlights? Davy contemplated this, and it seemed to scare him just as much as it did me. I shuddered, closing my eyes as I felt a puff of air on my cheek. The air was acrid, like sulfur, and I felt my teeth clacking together as I tried to retain the threads of my story. I couldn't stop now. I couldn't let it end this way. What would people think if I suddenly got mauled to death by this thing? That's when it hit me. There would be some record of this. I was still recording. That's when I noticed the red light on my camera was off. My blood ran cold. How long had it been since I stopped recording? The box still showed me the after image, recording or not, so I had no clue how long that camera had been off. Had it just stopped in the middle of my story? I couldn't very well check with the pestilential creature in my ear. It was, after all, my only audience now. Perhaps my last audience. It growled softly, and I read on, extending my life for the length of this creature's contribution. We went back inside, huddling in our tent, as the voices grew closer and closer. I was yelling out of pure habit now, just trying to drown out my fear as much as the sound of its bony jaws as they rubbed together. They kept calling our names, their voices coming closer and closer. I could feel the tears running down my face as my fear grew in intensity. I was crying, huddled in my sleeping bag, as Davy shuddered beside me, the voices growing closer and closer. Its breath was puffing in my ear, and I was shaking so hard that the words on the screen had begun to vibrate through my tears. I jumped when I heard the zipper open, looking up to see Davy as he stepped out into the night, looking back only once as the voices seemed to surround the tent. As he left, I heard him screaming. It was long and high, and it cut through the monotonous tone of their voices, the things grouped outside my tent. It ended suddenly, cut as though choked out of him, before his own voice joined that hellish choir. Its eyes were boring into me. I wished that if it meant to kill me, it would just do it. I suddenly knew how the boy in the story felt, menaced by forces outside his control and his understanding, except He had been spared having to see the hellish pursuers. I was eye to eye with mine as it waited for the thrilling climax before it pounced and brought my story to an end as well. Suddenly, they surrounded the tent, pushing and shoving, bending the walls with their bony hands. They pushed their faces against the fabric, and I could see their terrible features as they longed for what lay inside. Adults, children, animals, all of them seemed to be little more than skeletons as they menaced me. I zipped my sleeping bag up and lay quivering at the bottom as I blocked it all out, wishing it would end quickly. I was nearly screaming now, snot flying down my face as tears flowed down my cheeks in rivulets, making my white vampire makeup run. Suddenly, I could feel them around me, surrounding my sleeping bag, pushing against the fabric as I screamed and shivered in my bag. I heard the spidery sound of the zipper coming down. The creature opened its jaws, its sulfur breath puffing against my cheek, the sound of the monotonous voices calling me in their unchanging tone. I heard a growl begin in its throat. It sank its face into the mouth of the sleeping bag, and I saw its bony face as it looked at me. Its body tensed, its unnaturally long legs holding up its body, and I could see that it was the size of a large dog. I had glanced now and saw that it was like a rotten Doberman on somehow comical paper streamer legs. They were segmented and jointed oddly, like some Tim Burton nightmare creature. As I looked at it, breaking the cardinal rule, it growled hugely, sounding like a dog with a foghorn stuck in its throat. I screamed then, eyes wide as it reeled back on those ridiculous legs and lunged at me, its mouth full of sharp, bony teeth coming straight at my face. Then, suddenly, the lights came on. I blinked, eyes watering as I was momentarily blinded. When my eyes adjusted, it was gone.
Look, I know you're doing your little show in here, but could you keep it down, dude? I've got work in the morning and the reading doesn't usually bother me, but the yelling has got to... Dude, are you okay?
It was Reggie, my roommate. He was dressed in pajama bottoms and a sleeveless t-shirt, and he suddenly looked like the most extraordinary person in the world. He must have thought I was yelling for dramatic effect and come to tell me off. One look at my tear-stained face and snot runners down my nose, though, and he probably thought I was crazy. I wiped my face and told him it was okay now. I must have dozed off and been having a nightmare. He told me it was cool and left to go back to bed, jumping a little as I screamed at him not to turn off the lights. That was 2 weeks ago now. I haven't turned the lights off in that room since. Whether I'm there or not, I always keep the lights on. I don't go out after dark anymore, not even with a flashlight. I looked at the footage from the stream and found that it cut out just about the time the creature climbed off the bed. You can't see anything, not even the eyes, but I deleted the footage anyway. Just watching it gives me the creeps. I had to bury Chester as well. The second discovery that night was that my poor little guy had died right under my computer desk. His eyes were open and he looked like he'd seen just about the most terrifying thing imaginable. The vet cremated him after saying it appeared that his heart had just stopped. I put him in a shoebox and buried him outside by the big oak tree. I haven't even thought about getting another cat. People complain about my streams now. They say that the lights being on kills the ambience. I don't care. I won't sit in that dark anymore. I don't know if it being there was a fluke or if it was attracted by the story that night. I don't want to find out either. I know it hates the light. So from now on, the lights stay on. Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's reading. It's that time of the show again where we thank our patrons. Thank you to Leslie Lou Riddle for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributor. Thanks, Leslie. Couldn't do it without you. If you too would like to have your name read at the end of every episode, go to my Patreon and pledge $5 to be on our Spooky Skeleton tier. Or you can always buy a book off of Amazon if you'd like to support the channel in another way. Or you can always just come back next week for another story. We love to see you enjoy them. And as always, thank you for stopping by tonight. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.